I've jettisoned what I was going to speak of this morning, which was about things we're up to in this new little organization called the Alliance for Wild Ethics, or AWE, which is among other things, dedicated to the rejuvenation of oral culture as an ecological imperative. But I'm putting all that aside. I've been listening to the discussion this morning. I'll make a few links to things, but I want to start with words of this old Inuit woman named Nalungiak, whose words were recorded early in the last century by Knud Rasmussen, great Scandinavian explorer. This is one of the things she told him. She said, in the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, an animal could become a person if it wanted to, and a person could become another creature. Sometimes they were animals, sometimes they were people, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. See, that was the time when words were like magic. A word spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It would suddenly come alive, and what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. Nobody can explain this. That's just the way it was. So, what I like about that here is just simply the sense that words are a kind of magic. They profoundly transform our world. They shape the ways we think. And really, really influence the way we perceive things. What we say has such a profound influence upon what we see, or hear, or even taste of the earth around us. Now, the American philosopher Richard Rorty is not somebody that I agree with much on many things, but he did say one thing that I agree with deeply. Was something like this. He said, it's not those who argue well who are going to change the world. It's those who speak differently. It's not by arguing well that one will change the world, but by speaking differently. I agree with that. I'm looking for new ways of speaking and thinking. I mean, I think, being able to argue and make a point, that's pretty useful too. But finding new ways of putting our words together, I'm looking for ways of speaking and hence of thinking that, while they're maybe weirdly different, they're also very, very accessible, that any child can understand. And maybe they're infectious. That is, ways of speaking that wake our senses up to where we really are. Because it seems to me that we have become so blind to anything that is not human or made by humans. We've become so deaf to anything that does not speak in words. Can we find ways of speaking that don't continually sever the spontaneous kinship between our body and the flesh of this living world? I think there are ways of speaking that really stifle the reciprocity between our senses and the whole body of the sensuous around us. But there are also ways of speaking that make sense, that wake up our senses, that can encourage that rapport and reciprocity between the human animal and the animate earth. And sure, maybe, some of these we can't, if as we work on the poetics of how we talk, poetry not for poetry anthologies, but just as speaking creatively, maybe we can't apply this right away in our boardrooms or in public policy, but that's fine. We can speak about these. We can converse with our friends, try them on, talk to our kids at home, feel out these things. Maybe there are some that are infectious enough that they can spread like a contagion through the world. But I just want to give some simple examples here. One, and that's what I want to speak of this morning, just some different, fairly simple examples. A very simple one has to do with one of our most intimate relations to the earth itself, that is, this thing that when we jump up, we come down. We are under the influence of this body all the time, and we call it gravity. And we think of gravity as a law. It's the law of gravity. And ever since we started speaking of it as a law, we've stopped noticing it. It's just there, happens automatically. It's a law. You can write down the equation for it. So it sort of happens automatically, mechanically, and we stop paying attention to what was for so many millennia this outrageous mystery. What is gravity? You know, and my pondering of this, you know, notion is certainly inspired and sparked some by our brother Brian Swim, the physicist, cosmologist. But what is this mystery? We speak of it today as the mutual attraction between bodies at a distance. Mutual attraction between bodies at a distance. Yeah, that sounds a lot like Eros. It sounds a lot like Eros. The mutual attraction between bodies. What if we were to begin to think of or speak of gravity as Eros? As this intense erotic attraction of my body for the body of the Earth's body for me. Brian speaks of it as allurement, but I'm wanting to think of it as something as Eros, because I want to say that the attraction that, you know, sparks between me and my lover, or that draws me toward somebody who I've just met and is drawing him or her toward me, that Eros is just like a little ripple on the surface of this big ocean of Eros, always pulsing away between my body and the body of the earth. I mean, we have some notion of this in our language, because when we speak of falling in love, we call it falling in love. We sort of know that there's something about gravity linked to love, linked to Eros. We fall in love. But how does that then shift my sense of when I walk? And each step on the ground. How easily it is, if one tries it and holds this notion in mind just a little bit, the sense of delicious nourishment that comes with any step upon the ground. And how I begin to walk a little more slowly, because it's like the food that is coming into me from the contact with my lover, just like placing my hand upon my sweetheart's belly. Continually, we are walking upon this ground, and drawing that nourishment, if we allow it, if our language allows us to notice it. Okay, another one. Picking right up and off from there, maybe one that can connect a bit with the atmospheric scientists in the room, but, well, here I say we're walking on the earth, but why do we say that we live and dwell on the earth? We live on the earth. This is such a trope in our culture, but I mean, come on, does the air exist? Is this a part of the earth? Surely it is. Although in our culture we have this sense, anyway, it seems that if you can't see something, then it's not there. It's invisible. The air's weird. It's invisible. We can't see it, therefore it's just empty space. So we don't speak of the air between Bob and myself, or between myself and the spruce out there. We speak of the empty space between us, which is odd because it ain't empty. It's filled. It's thick. It's just we don't see it, but we can feel it. So we say we live on the earth, but heck, I mean, sometimes when I'm working with students and I just take us outside and I say, check out those clouds up there. And if this tent wasn't here, we could be looking up at some large clouds drifting by now. But we know that the earth is spinning a couple thousand miles an hour, around its axis. So those clouds should be very rapidly dashing off to the west, but they're not. They're just kind of lolling there, and some of them are floating a bit toward the south right now. Sometimes they move westward, sometimes eastward. Why is that? Because they're accompanying the earth completely as it moves, as it spins. That is to say, up there, those clouds, that's earth. We don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. We are immersed in the earth, embedded in the earth. But we have so many ways of speaking that hold us aloof. This confluence of this little conference of folks reminds me in a way that no other gathering has done of the early first initial conferences that were called to begin to formulate ecopsychology, to sort of launch this new notion by Ted Rozak, brought together, about 10 ecologists and 10 psychologists at a couple, 2 or 3 gatherings on the West Coast, and Jim Hillman was there, and various other good souls, and some very worthy biologists and naturalists, ecologists. And the conversations were about, well, here we've got the psychologists who study the inner world and the ecologists who study the outer world of nature. And so all of our conversations had to be about how does the world out here, where there's trees and animals and clouds and stuff like that, influence the inner world of the psyche in here? And how can we articulate the connections between the mind or the psyche, which is in us, and nature, which is outside of us? And these conversations, everybody was doing these bizarre sort of intellectual gymnastics to try and figure out ways to articulate the influence going this way or going the other way, from the inner psyche out to the... And it just seemed terribly goofy to me and unparsimonious, because, I mean, heck, if this is really about ecopsychology, why don't we, at least us here, for the purposes of this discussion, why don't we just drop the idea that the psyche is in us? I mean, why do we have to still carry forward this notion that consciousness is this exclusively human property? So in the last paper, my brother was speaking of, how even Jung was feeling that consciousness is the gift that we two-leggeds bring to the world. We are the world, become conscious, whatever. And I can understand where he was coming from at that time, but now maybe we can be a little bit wilder in our thinking, a little bit more alive, a little more awake, and realize that, heck, geez, I mean, maybe consciousness is not ours to begin with. Maybe it's Earth's, and we're in it, along with all the other animals and the plants and the drifting clouds. Maybe mind is not ours, but is Earth's. I mean, for heaven's sakes, nobody really knows what the hell the mind is anyway, or consciousness, or psyche. I'm in touch with quite a few cognitive scientists, both of a neurological bent and those who are working in a more philosophical way. But these guys and gals can't agree even on the most basic parameters of what the hell they're talking about. It's the mind or the psyche, and pardon to my Jungian brothers and sisters here to be conflating those for the moment. I don't really mean to be conflating them, but for the purposes of what I'm saying here, I think that's okay, because they're both so mysterious, amorphous, utterly ephemeral. You can't get a handle on it. You can't grasp the mind or the psyche. And so it's notoriously difficult to get a handle on it, to speak of it. And it's invisible. It's ineffable. And it's so damn changeable or metamorphic. As any meditator knows, it can be nice and calm and clear at one moment, and then the next moment, somehow, it's just filled with turbulence. In fact, it's ineffable, it's invisible, turbulent, calm, and it's a lot like the air. It's a lot like the air. This amorphous, invisible stuff that we cannot grasp, can't predict. We just do our best to sort of track it and follow its patterns or habits, but it's really out of our control. It is wild. It's wildness personified, in a sense. The air, the atmosphere of this earth. So I want to ask again, what if the mind or the psyche is not ours, but is Earth's? What if the air is aware? What if the psyche, well, maybe there is something inward or interior about the mind or the psyche, but it's not because it's inside us, but because we are inside it, bodily immersed in the psyche, as are all of the other animals, and the spruces, and the aspen groves, and the mountains, and the drifting clouds overhead, because we live enveloped in the psyche of this planet. Anybody know where the term psyche comes from?
Butterfly.
The Greek term, butterfly was one of its emblems. The verb was psychein, which meant to breathe or to blow like the wind. And the noun, a psyche or a psyche, was originally a breath or a gust of wind. That's the very origin of our term psyche, from which we get psychology and psychiatry and ecopsychology. What if the air is aware? So the Navajo people near where I live, or the Diné, as they call themselves, the people, simply means, they've got this, a kind of, their most cosmological, actually sort of monotheistic notion is something they call Nilchi. Nilchi. And Nilchi means the holy wind. And the holy wind is the whole body of the air, which includes the sky overhead, but it's also this invisible air that moves around us, swirls between us and all of the things around us, and also swirls and circulates within us. They speak of the wind within one. But the wind within us is entirely continuous with the wind all around us, and it is wind, holy wind, nilchi, that gives all things life and breath and awareness. Everything that partakes of the air or of the holy wind is aware. And they say it is so sacred to us, and it's so mysterious because it's invisible. You cannot grasp it, you can't see it, but you can feel it. It's still palpable. And you can see it by the way it moves things. You see it lofting the clouds. You can see it bending the branches. You can see that you can't think a single thought without continually imbibing this invisible substance. So how do we know that our thoughts are not being thunk, in a sense, by the wind? It seems to be moving everything else around us. Well, so they say, although we can't see it directly, we can also see it by the traces that it leaves. It leaves these little spiraling patterns wherever it moves. And whenever you see a spiral somewhere visible, you know that holy wind has been there. And so these little spirals in our fingertips are where 10 little winds, they say, you know, the fingerprints, 10 little winds entered into our fingertips when we were born. And the spirals in our toe tips are where 10 little winds entered our toes. And the winds in our toe tips hold us to the ground, and the winds in our fingertips hold us to the sky, and that's why we don't fall down when we're walking. But they say, the Navajo elders, the chanters, say, well, there are also these spirals in the folds of our ears, in our ear folds here. And that's how we know that there are 2 little winds hanging out, one in each ear. Wind's children, they call them. And when you're thinking thoughts, when you hear that play of words inside your head, that sort of monkey mind, roof brain chatter, well, the Navajo elders are somewhat more respectful in the way they speak of it. They say, well, that's just wind's children talking to you from inside your ears. When you're thinking thoughts, when you hear that play of words, that's just the wind's children talking to you from inside your ears. But of course, wind's children are just sort of the messengers of the winds of the 4 directions, who themselves are subsidiaries of the big body of Nilchi, the holy wind. So this is a notion of wind as mind. It is wind that thinks in us. The early anthropologists who came through Diné country, who were missionaries, many of them, and they heard this notion of the wind within one, the wind that circulates within, and they translated this as the inner spirit, as the spirit. But they missed what is so crucial to the Navajo, to the Diné worldview, which is that the wind within one is entirely continuous with the wind moving all around you. And this notion of mind and wind as wind, which notice, it's so different from, of course, the way we've all been taught, a notion of the psyche, not as that, or of mind, not as that which separates us two-leggeds from everything else in the surrounding landscape, but precisely as what connects us to everything around, to the grasses, to the spruces, to the clouds, to the swallows swooping by. And yet this notion can sound ludicrous to us, born and raised in the West, in the civilized West, until we notice the evidences in our words. Like, of course, the word spirit, which comes from the Latin spiritus, which originally means a breath or a gust of wind. Just like psyche comes from the Greek term, psyche, which means a breath or a gust of wind. But what about, well, take anima, the Latin word for soul. Anima, from which we get an animated thing, or unanimous, being of one mind or one soul. Anima. Jung's notion of the anima and the animus. Where does anima come from? Actually, the Latin term comes from the Greek word anemos, anemos, which meant the wind. Anemos, wind. Even such a scientifically respectable word as atmosphere. Where does that come from? What's the root of that? Sanskrit term, atman, the word for soul. The original word is atmos, which meant the soul which is the air which is the soul. In fact, if you take the words for mind or spirit or psyche in any language and trace them back to their oral origins, you will find at least one of them that names the air as the very body of that mystery we call psyche, a mind. to say a word from my own tribal tradition, which is the Jewish tradition, we too in Hebrew have a word that names the spirit and the wind inseparably as the same thing. The term is ruach. Ruach, sometimes translated as rushing spirit. It is the very presence of the divine, of God, within the body's world. And it's invisible. That's why it's so sacred, so holy. Ruach, the rushing spirit. And it's a very holy term within our tradition. It's there in the first sentence of the Hebrew Bible. The world was without form and void, and a ruach of God moved over the waters. A wind of God moved over the waters. Sacred term. It is not the most sacred term within the Hebrew language. That would be the four-letter name of God, YHWH, or the Hebrew letters are Yud, He, Vav, He. We've all heard this spoken or pronounced as Yahweh, and probably most of you know that that's fairly illegitimate, because we don't know really how to pronounce this name, the four-letter name, the tetragrammaton, the Greeks called it. It is the most magic utterance within the Jewish tradition, within the Hebrew tradition, this name of the divine that we don't know how to say. Why don't we know how to speak it? Well, because there's no vowels in the name. It's just YHWH. Well, why didn't you guys write down the vowels? Well, because in fact, the Hebrew alphabet, which is as close as we can get to the earliest of all alphabets, including the Roman one that we use today, but the original alphabet has no vowels in it. It's just consonants. We only wrote down the consonants. Well, that's kind of stupid. Why didn't you folks write down the vowels too? Well, the vowels, you see, there was a good reason. The consonants are the shapes we give to the breath as it moves through the mouth. A, E, A, O, U are the sounds made by the unimpeded breath as it moves. But the consonants are the shapes we give it. B, K, D, W. We'll write down those shapes. But the breath, A, E, U, Ah, that is the ruach. The breath is the invisible spirit. You can't make a visible representation of the invisible spirit. And so we didn't do it. We just wrote the consonants. And so when you read a traditional Torah scroll in the synagogue today, you have to sort of lend your breath to those bones on the page to make them come alive and begin to speak. That is, the text can speak differently each time you come to it by varying the vowels, by varying the breath sounds. You sing it up in a fresh way each time. That's why in our tradition it said the Torah has something completely new to say in every generation. You got to grapple with it, figure out what it's trying to say now, which is something it's never said before. But that's just a fancy way of saying, gee, we couldn't write down the vowels, so you got to figure it out. If you look at this four-letter name of God, recognizing that the consonants are there, but no vowels. Well, maybe we need to meditate upon the letters that make up this name, as the Kabbalists did. Central Kabbalistic practice, meditating upon the letters of the alphabet, and especially upon the letters of the most holy name. You notice that maybe after you've been meditating a few years, there's something about these consonants. They are the most breath-like consonants in any writing system, in any phonetic writing system. Y, the Y, the H, the W, and the H repeats itself. So it's Y, H, W, and H. And then you go back on your mat and you meditate some more upon that. And you might begin to realize, that there is something kind of magic about this name. And the pronunciation, which has always been known to be secret, which is to say sacred, because of course secret and sacred are the same word, is probably nothing like we've heard it. This most holy name of God in the Western tradition, ow, I will not dare to say until this dies away. But if I were to say it, it might sound so different from the way we've heard it. It might sound more like this. That this most holy name in our tradition is the name we all speak whenever we're conscious of our breathing. This rocking in and out of ourselves that binds the invisible depths within us to the invisible depths all around us, connecting my breast with that of the hummingbird swooping by, and the spruce tree drinking in the carbon dioxide I've breathed out, and breathing out the oxygen I'm breathing. I mean, we're like of one mind with the world, one psyche with the world. I'll finish that thought there and just say, I don't know, do I have another 5 minutes? No.
Yes, sure.
Oh, okay.
Do I have a watch?
The ways we speak. Obviously there's a vast host of other examples, and I'm sure pretty much everybody in the tent could toss in really great examples of your own, of turns of phrase that might be a little able to induce a kind of gestalt shift in the way we feel, ourselves in relation to the earth, to the ground, to gravity, to the wind, to the air, to the other critters. I want to just say a word now about what is right on my leading edge of my confusion at the moment and my grappling and my struggle, because folks might have some insight, or it's something I don't understand very well, but I am aware that in my work I bump up against a taboo over and over and over again, different taboos, particularly because I'm praising so often the other animals. I'm praising the ground. I'm praising even the rocks and the wind. But this strikes people from different directions. Always is there's something problematic in this. And I've begun to notice over the years that there is, underneath the various flashpoints and taboos or buttons I seem to be pushing, there seems to be one common taboo that's deeper than all the others. And that's just my hunch. It's my intuition, but I feel quite sure of it at this point, at least for myself. And that is a sense that that I think is so deeply ingrown in our culture, in our language, in our ways of thinking and speaking, whether we are farmers or physicists, scientists or mythologists, we're all carrying it. And that is this deep, ancient, layered in sense that down there, deep under the ground, it's bad. That at the heart of the earth, I don't want to talk about it. That's hell, or that's where the devil lives, or that's basically the bad place. And so anybody who's really praising this world or speaking of, Mary Evelyn spoke of yesterday of, the problem of our current, some of the awful aspects of our current worldview she named materialism. We're so materialist. But for me, afterwards, I had to go up to Mary Evelyn and say, well, I am a materialist. I love matter. I'm trying to keep faith with matter. But even my most progressive brothers and sisters want to still say that, it's materialism is the problem. Our culture is not, we don't pay respect to matter, to the materials we use to make things. There's a sense that matter is problematic. It's sinful. Well, actually, we've grown out of that. We no longer think of the material world as sinful, demonic, fallen. We now, in the modern world, have graduated to speaking of it as inert, mechanical, determinate. But it's just a modern translation of the same derogation, the same insult, the same sense that we can't speak respectfully of this stuff because those who really are caught in that are perhaps under the influence of the great deceiver or of there's something, I don't want to even talk about it, and why are you talking about it so much? So I just think this is very deep in us, and it's very deep in our tradition, and I look at what's coming down in the world today, and I can't help but feel, that it's linked to our sense of a pure, undefiled good that has no shadow to it whatsoever. And hence is thought of always in opposition to an autonomous evil. And this came up in the last, talking in this morning, and that's why I wanted to bring this in, that a pure good at war with or in opposition to an autonomous evil, that's all bad. And I think as long as it seems to me, are buying into that, the earth is going to suffer. The earth is going to suffer and suffer. Because it's not this notion of the good as without shadow and without taint, and then it's very easy to just believe I'm in league with that one, and there's the evil, and I'm going to wipe it out. But earth is filled with shadow and solidity and density and gravity and weight. And so as long as we think of the good in this, how did somebody say it this morning, in this severed way, cut off from its own richness and vitality and wild shadowed life, evil is always going to be, though it be unconscious in most of us moderns, it's still located down at the heart of matter. And the luminous source is up there. And I'm interested in monkey wrenching this, in untying this knot, dissolving it, finding ways to dream it differently, to begin to feel that at the heart of the earth is. That's the good. And it's radiating out from there, yes, into our feet as we walk on the ground. And it's not different from that luminous sun traversing overhead, if that's one's image for the good. And that luminosity, you see it climb down there in the west, beyond the mountains, it sinks down into the earth, and then it rises up out of the ground in the morning, so at night, what is it doing but, just sort of slipping through the ground, feeding it with its fiery life. Down there is where the sun sleeps, at the heart of the earth. That's the way the old ones used to speak of it. But us post-Copernicans, maybe we can begin to find a similar way, because the earth is gripped by the sun, by that solar power. Where? At the earth's center of gravity. And so the sun holds the earth in its grip. At the earth's center of gravity, which is down there. The rest of the earth is spinning round that axis. But our most direct link to the sun is not overhead, but always, not just during the night, but by day as well. It's down there. That's the source of that luminosity and that light. that also greets us by day overhead, beginning to find these ways of pondering. Enough said. Thanks.
I just wanted to say I've never thought of what's down there as a source of badness, and that just seems so foreign to me. And I wonder if, sort of looking through the lens of geology, that we can begin to think of Earth as the source of creation.
Yeah.
For that is what has brought all of this into being, the marriage between what is down there and what is up there. So.
Indeed. And I can't help but suspect that, as we move toward renewable sources of energy, it ain't just going to be wind and solar. It's also going to be geothermal energy. And beginning to realize, whoa, we're drinking from that source down there. If that'll help shift this, I think it is a very deeply set notion, but it's true. I've never thought of it that way, but I do notice it in my language often, and in the sort of insulting way we speak of matter and materiality, not as, that the light lives at the heart of the stone. Yeah?
I would just like to add on to your comment too. As a geologist, I've often thought the same way, that it's not a bad place to be. And when I have looked at what is actually happening with the core and the mantle and the exchange of energy that goes on beneath the surface, I was really fascinated to discover that there's only one or two elements that come up that so far that we have found from the deep core that actually come up to the surface, get transformed at the surface, and then re-enter the earth and go back down to the core through all of the heat and energy exchange processes. And for whatever reason, the earth wants to bring a few of these very, very rare elements to the surface for a short period of time, and then they are re-entering into the core. And so I've always, as a geologist, thought of it as that's the process, that's the place of transformation. And that transformation doesn't have to happen in a transcendent kind of place, but happens immersed in that deep thermal, energetic
Indeed.
heating up the place.
It's like the Alchemist's Crucible. Yeah.
I wanted to also pick up on what you said and what you said, David, when you opened up. But I really want to address this to Andrew Light. Because I really take seriously what you said at the end of the session. And if we, coming from a psychological perspective, cannot find a way to make what we're saying compatible with the disciplines and the perspectives and the language you come from, then I think we have failed. I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but that's how I heard it. So I'm trying to find a way to speak to the question of global warming that honors the way that you as a philosopher, what Mary Evelyn was saying, what the scientists were saying. And I don't know if this works, but this is the best that I can do coming from my tradition. So here's an effort to try and listen into what I heard you trying to say today. My first introduction into nature happened when I was no more than 6 years old. And it would happen every day of the first day of summer vacation, when we were free of school. And I would get up as early as I could to leave the house before my parents started the round of the day, before the day began its busyness. And I would just look at the wind and the trees. But particularly what fascinated me was a patch of brown dirt where everything else was green grass. And it was like they were always there on the first day of summer vacation, a line of black ants coming and going out of the hole in the ground. And I still remember to this day, and I've written about it, that that's when the notion of depth And I didn't think psychologically then because I hadn't read a book yet in psychology. I was only 6. I began to realize that if I could only follow those ants through that hole into the earth, I would know something that was magical and a secret. My question is there a place in ecology and with all of the crises that we are facing, is there a place within the dialogue that addresses it from a scientific point of view to honor those moments when nature speaks to us in that way? Call it a spiritual way if you want. Do we have a place in our concerns? You said yesterday, Andrew, 10 years, time is running out. These kinds of concerns you said are not a necessary condition. I want to try and make an appeal. Can we speak to each other in a way that those kind of moments about the elements, which are also us, have a place in the dialogue as a value?
I sure hope so.
Yeah. And I am serious. I'm changing
I
my
believe-
talk.
I believe it's true. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to change my talk this afternoon because I want to try and find a way and address the issue that has come up. I think psychology, as Susie said, can oftentimes be an off-putting language. You can never get anybody to change anything if you start out by saying, even giving the impression, we're whole, you're not. That's not the way to do it. You've got to make a space for people to feel where they are missing something.
But you know, that's what David just did.
Yes, that's
He
what
offered
I'm
an
saying.
incantation. And as he was speaking, I was in the aspens. Because the wind came through my body because his incantation brought me there, because he offered us the actual direct experience of the wind, because he went beyond language. So I think we need to call attention to what he did, because that is the middle ground we're aspiring to reach through direct experience.
Yeah, that's why I told the story at the end. That was my way of saying what David did was an experience for me too.
I'll just say,
Actually, Carolyn had her hand up.
David, I want to thank you for that. It was fantastic. And I want to connect it to what Robert started off our day with the idea of breathing and inspiration, and inspire and conspire go together with all the beings breathing at once on the earth. And to the Greek idea of the pneuma, which was the breath that you inhaled, and that was the connection between every person and the world around them. And you could not be separated from that. You could not stop breathing and still be alive. And David's wonderful chapter on the remembering and forgetting of the air draws on that early tradition. And in the Renaissance, the notion that the earth is alive and the earth breathes and respires and has circulation and elimination and a mind, that was lost when the spiritus mundi, the pneuma, that everyone breathed in, was eliminated by Descartes. And we had mind and body, the material, corporeum mundi, and the mind. The spirit was gone, and that connection to the earth and the person to the more than human world was gone. And to have it coming back under the guise of global warming and fear and terror, and to having the inspiration of the breath of the world as we're sitting here in this beautiful place. I thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
I hope everybody noticed that a butterfly
Yeah.
flew in and out.
Uh-huh.
You were talking.
Just say a brief thing in response to that, because one of the points I was just now trying to make too is that when we notice the air, and only when we notice it, do we realize that we live inside this world. We don't just live on its surface. We are deeply embedded in the earth. And an interior perspective begins to enter even into one's science. Because what ecology inherited from all of the previous sciences is this assumption, the sort of pretense of the spectator view. Looking at whatever we study, including nature or a stone or a wetland, as though we were not a part of it. Disembodying ourselves, looking at it from a God's eye perspective, as it were. A view from nowhere. Ecology is so subversive that way, as the study of the relation between organisms and their environment, because ever since Darwin, we've had to acknowledge, gosh, well, we are one of the organisms. And so ecology also has to be a recognition, my God, that every instance of my studying a rock, a wetland, a forest, is an instance of this relationship of an earthly organism with its world. We can't get outside of it to get a sheer God's eye view on the whole thing. So it seems to me that part of the difficulty between, in the languages between ecology and psychology is that the sciences have had to affect this, this objectifying way of always speaking of the world as if from outside. But we can be more rigorous than that, as scientists too, in acknowledging, my God, that we're down inside here. We're embedded, embodied, co-evolved with all this stuff, and we can't get a purely impartial take on it. Last thing I wanted to say is, it's not just Brother Descartes, poor bro, we lay all of our shit on him, but yeah, he solidified something. But already with Copernicus, something quite magical and strange, hugely strange, happened, because the Ptolemaic universe, which was so, the concentric spheres, and each of the planets was on its own crystalline sphere, and then the outer sphere of the fixed stars was, and they were felt to be, before the telescope, that was way up there. It might take a week's hiking if you could hike straight up to reach the stars. It was really far away for the pre-Socratics, as in maybe it would take 2 weeks hiking. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it was a very intimate cosmos, and these were layers of the earth. And we felt inside of this nested, concentric, wombish world. Copernicus, Galileo, the telescope itself exploded that sense of an intimate interior. Suddenly, the vertigo everybody was feeling in the 17th century, 18th, it's just you're floating in infinite space. There's nothing to contain. And all of these qualitative things that we ascribe to the mind and subjectivity, feelings, all that stuff, they're fluid-like. They need something to contain them. And when the world out here suddenly became this inexhaustible, vast exterior with no bound, all those qualities fled into the human skull. And that's the birth of this private interior. But it's as recent as that.